What's on your radar, Ryan?
Well, so tomorrow, Joe Biden travels to Philadelphia for a major speech on voting rights after several days of the White House stepping on rakes in its front yard. The rake stepping started on Thursday when the White House scheduled two separate events that couldn't have been more poorly timed if they tried. The first was at Howard University, where Kamala Harris gave her own speech that was also supposed to be about voting rights. Instead, she unveiled a new DNC project called I Will Vote. Responding to the upsurge in voter suppression bills around the country, Harris barely mentioned the legislative response and instead said the party would be spending this $25 million to register and turn people out.
In Congress, leaders are working to pass two bills into law that would protect and strengthen voting rights. And there is another important component of our work together, and that is mobilizing to ensure Americans vote in the elections coming up ahead.
They even unveiled an entire merch store. Now, obviously, there's nothing inherently wrong with merch or with registering people to vote. But the response that Democrats have been saying is required isn't just paying more people to carry around clipboards, but it's to attack voter suppression laws directly with the For the People Act, or H.R. 1. For months, there's been a faction of the White House arguing internally for Biden not to hit the gas on voting rights because the bill probably won't pass. And so it's better to focus on other legislation and just make sure to, quote, out-organize Republicans in the midterms. Given that Biden basically didn't run a presidential campaign, that's not a serious proposal. It's just a fig leaf for giving up. If you remember, earlier this year, as election reform was starting to stumble on Capitol Hill, Biden handed the issue off to Kamala, just as he had asked her to handle the migrant crisis at the border and the fight for gun control legislation. In other words, Biden is doing to Harris what Obama did to Biden, giving all the doomed or politically impossible tasks to the vice president. When Biden handed off election reform to Harris, it set off groans among those still fighting for it because it isn't dead yet. After the Howard speech on Thursday, Biden and Harris met with civil rights leaders from around the country for a previously scheduled gathering. The last time they met, it was over Zoom, and I obtained a recording of the meeting, during which Biden repeatedly shouted down the civil rights leaders.
Let's get something straight. You shouldn't be disappointed. What I've done so far is more than anybody else has done this far. Okay? Number one. Number two, I mean what I say when I say it. I mean what I say when I say it. I'm the only person who's ever run on three platforms that I was told could not possibly win the election, and I never ceased from it. One was on restoring the soul of this country because of what I saw happen in Charlottesville. That was it. No one else was talking about it. The words of presidents matter. Nobody else. No progressive.
He also promised he would appoint an attorney general with a long history of civil rights work, which didn't happen. The timing of the meeting, coming right after Harris's speech, was coincidental, but was bad luck for the White House. It was scheduled for an hour, but it went for an hour and 40 minutes. This meeting was in person, and I don't have a recording of it, unfortunately, but from what I've been told, it was quite contentious. Normally, when civil rights leaders leave a meeting with the president, they talk about what a productive meeting it was and pledge to continue working together on shared goals. Not this time. Al Sharpton, for instance, called it, quote, candid and no holds barred.
H.R. 1 or Senate Bill 1 and the John Lewis bill is mandatory. But at the same time, if we don't put the street heat on, it will not happen.
And other civil rights leaders were equally blunt, suggesting that the White House simply didn't understand the urgency of the moment. They pledged a week of direct confrontations ahead, followed by protests through the summer.
When they come back next week, the senators who would not allow for a vote to take place, to even discuss the election, should not be able to just walk around like everything's okay. It's not.
They reminded Biden that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 65 weren't passed without a fight.
We wanted the president to understand that as Martin Luther King and Andrew Young left this very White House in 64 and went south to begin the movement that led to the 65 Voting Rights Act, we leave here today saying we will create the movement on the ground to protect that right.
Harris talked about history too, but talked about it entirely differently.
Let's look back at history. Howard teaches us to always remember our history. In 1964, Americans awakened by the civil rights movement wanted the Voting Rights Act. They voted, and they got it.
Okay, that is completely nuts. Not only does it skip right over the '64 Civil Rights Act that came before the election, it implies that all voters have to do to win voting rights is vote, which makes absolutely no sense. You first need the right to vote in order to cast that vote. So despite this incoherent lack of effort from the Biden administration, the For the People Act has passed the House of Representatives already, and Joe Manchin is now negotiating the details of a voting rights and election reform bill in the Senate. Cynics look at that House vote, though, and they scoff. Well, the House only passed it because they thought it was dead in the Senate, so that doesn't actually mean anything, people argue. But here's the thing. That's probably true, but it actually doesn't matter. Members of Congress are not Nostradamus. They might think they know what's happening next in our political world, but nobody knows for sure. In fact, go back to February 1964 when the House took up the Civil Rights Act that year. At first, the House wouldn't even vote on it, but under intense pressure from LBJ in the White House and the civil rights movement in the streets, they finally agreed to put it on the floor. The bill included two titles that everyone in Washington knew for sure could absolutely never become law. One of them banned discrimination in public accommodations like hotels or movie theaters or lunch counters. Another banned discrimination in hiring. No way could that happen. Except the public was overwhelmingly supportive of it, and Congress was under pressure to do something. When it looked like it might actually pass the House, Southern Democrats made a last-ditch effort they thought was clever. They added the word sex to the list of categories to be protected against discrimination. They figured nobody in their right mind would support both gender and racial equality in the same bill. But the Northern Coalition shrugged and accepted the amendment. There was no chance, they figured, that the bill could overcome a Senate filibuster, so what did it matter anyway? It passed the House 290 to 130 with a bunch of conservative Republicans in the North voting for it out of political expediency, figuring it was a free vote. Here's how the New York Times headlined it. Civil rights bill passed by House in 290 to 130 vote. Hard Senate fight seen. Filibuster likely. But then a funny thing happened. LBJ didn't give up. He famously told his old friend and mentor, Richard Russell, an arch white supremacist who was deeply hostile to civil rights, that he wasn't taking out the controversial titles and that he planned to pass the thing and break a filibuster without changing so much as a comma. It took 4 months of cajoling and marching, but he delivered on the promise and shocked Washington by breaking the filibuster. A few small changes had been made, so it had to go back through the House, but by now it had runaway momentum, and it took the House just a few days to move it to his desk. That November, LBJ won with one of the biggest landslides in history, beating Senator Barry Goldwater, who had not just voted against the Civil Rights Act, but back in 1957, when Strom Thurmond had launched the longest anti-civil rights filibuster in history, Goldwater had been the senator who spelled him for bathroom breaks. Compare LBJ's approach to Biden's. When LBJ was being counseled to just drop the issue by his advisors, worried it could cost him politically, he shot back, well, what the hell's the presidency for? Biden's answer so far is that the presidency is for selling voting rights merch. And you know what? I'm not so sure it's true that they can even raise that $25 million. The rich liberal donor class they'll be tapping for it wants voting rights reform partly because they're sick of being asked to fill the hole, and also because they actually want democracy reform. But even if they do raise the money, all they've done then is validate the Republican criticism of the bill. Mitch McConnell keeps saying Democrats don't want more democracy, they just want more Democrats. If Democrats can give up on voting rights reform and instead just register more people to vote and still win, then McConnell was right. And this wasn't ever about democracy, it was just about winning. But voting rights matter independently of who those people vote for. Voting is not just a means to an end, it's something people have fought and died for. And it's what connects us as a people to our government. Giving up on voting rights because you think you can out-organize Republicans is just as cynical as Republican efforts to suppress the vote in order to rig elections in their own direction. It's also not likely to work. At least the Republican cynicism will probably get results. The good news is that Biden and Harris aren't the only party leaders, and Chuck Schumer does seem serious about getting this done. The obstacle remaining is the filibuster, and McConnell seems hell-bent on proving to Democrats that if they want to get anything done, even on infrastructure, they're going to have to go it alone. So just in the same way that the Tea Party accidentally saved Obama from his worst impulses to cut Medicare and Social Security, maybe McConnell can save Democrats from Joe Biden's worst instincts. It wouldn't be the first time that opponents of a civil rights bill got too clever and ended up playing themselves. Remember how those Dixiecrats got cute and snuck the word sex into the Civil Rights Act in the House, knowing it would never pass the Senate? Well, last year, Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, relying on a judicial philosophy he calls textualism, ruled that a company's workplace civil rights protections must extend to transgender people, a major victory that had eluded the civil rights movement. To ground his decision, he cited the clause in the Civil Rights Act that specifically singled out sex as a protected category. And for that, we have those clever Dixiecrats to thank. Even the Washington Post is starting to notice how lackluster Biden has been on voting rights. In a column yesterday, Perry Bacon Jr. slammed Biden for taking his eye off of voting rights and looking to just register voters instead. What good is registering all those people if state laws are shutting down polling locations, moving them without warning, and disqualifying people who cast provisional ballots at the wrong precinct, most of whom happen to be Democrats? Joe Biden likes to think of himself as the second coming of FDR, but so far he's been more like LBJ, who as president surprised liberals by shedding his conservative politics and reversing much of what he'd helped to do. Biden and LBJ are also both serving during a time of racial upheaval, with civil rights protesters in the streets both times, and with white backlash building both times. In the 60s, Democratic leaders like JFK and LBJ got behind the movement's demands for civil rights and voting rights, and LBJ had a direct line open to the leaders of the street movements. This time around, Biden has a direct line to civil rights leaders, but they're largely leaders of groups whose roots are in the 60s and Selma, not in Ferguson. Now, the groups that were at the White House are all obviously supportive of the movement for Black lives and have been involved in protests, but nobody would mistake them for leaders of that movement. And the movement certainly has not made the For the People Act front and center in their demands. The most high-profile demand, defund the police, is now ridiculed and attacked by establishment Democrats. In a recent interview with Mehdi Hasan, Jim Clyburn, himself a longtime civil rights leader, attacked it with shocking rhetoric, equating the slogan to the illegal police maneuver that killed Eric Garner.
Defund the police is a non-starter, even with Black people. And if you don't think that's true, then look at the results of what just happened in New York City's election. So the proof is in the pudding. I know what I'm talking about. I talk to people every day. And defund the police is a chokehold around the Democratic Party.
So the civil rights groups will no doubt build some street pressure in the coming weeks, with the emphasis on the word some. And BLM is unlikely to take up the cause en masse. The rest is going to be up to Biden. A major difference between Biden and LBJ was that LBJ was willing to fight for it, even though it looked like he'd lose at the outset. So far, Biden just seems to want it handed to him or he can't be bothered. That's not how it works. And if tomorrow is just a one-off speech, it simply won't work. So I know you in particular have followed that Neil Gorsuch case.
Right.
But to me, what it really reflects is that observers in Washington are always so all-knowing about where things are headed, what's possible, and what's not possible. And they get a complete pass every time they're wrong. Because if they're wrong, they say, wow, well, what an impressive feat by LBJ to get all of this accomplished. And then all the focus is on LBJ and the civil rights movement accomplishing this thing. And everybody forgets that all of Washington had spent the entire year saying that this was simply impossible.
Yeah, so is it your contention that Biden basically heard he tuned into the legacy media's basically drumbeat that H.R. 1 was flawed and doomed and too broad, and as that sort of built, he tuned into it and sort of refocused his attention? Yes,
well, or he just dropped it. And so it's now that he's going to Philadelphia, and there's been a ton of pressure on him since that Harris speech. He may be picking it back up again. We will see. But like I said, there's been this faction of the White House that has said this is a loser. We can't do this. We're going to lose anyway in the midterms. So put all of your capital into the infrastructure package and to passing your agenda. And instead of dealing with voting rights, just raise a bunch of money and go out and register voters.
Right.
And so Kamala Harris's speech at Howard University on Thursday signaled to people that that faction was now ascendant within the White House, that she was willing to go out and give a voting rights speech. And that clip I played was basically the only reference she made to the legislative response. Just said, there are 2 bills that we should probably pass, but here's the thing that we should do. We should go mobilize and out-organize, and here's the merch store, the I Will Vote mugs and the T-shirts. But there's just so many things wrong with that approach. It's that registering people to vote is not a response to voter suppression laws.
It's interesting to me because in the radar, you pointed out things like in local cases where polling places are being closed in ways that would disproportionately hit black voters. But H.R. 1 is like an extremely broad bill, and it seems to me that the Biden administration is sort of mirroring, like you say, the legacy media's arc when it comes to H.R. 1. First, a lot of excitement, and then as Democrats sort of parsed the bill and like picked through the actual legislation, they were like, well, this is pretty flawed. This was sort of cobbled together by Hill staffers, and then their public opinion on it shifted, and the Biden administration shifted. Do you think this is a reflection of the bill's many flaws, or do you think it's, well, maybe you don't accept that the bill has flaws, but
no, I don't think so, because I think all bills are flawed.
That's
like
true.
And there's a legislative process. You introduce a bill, people give you feedback, you make tweaks to it, and that's what's happened so far. But the White House has watched that process unfold and said, well, never mind. Let's just register people to vote.
Yeah, and there's also been, there has been a lot of criticism of H.R. 1 from the left, and not just from the establishment left. There has been some good criticism of it, but to your point, all bills are flawed, and if the Biden administration wanted H.R. 1 to really be improved, I guess there would be an effort that would be pretty discernible on their part to fix it.
Right, and we'll see if over the next several weeks and months they bring that to bear.
Interesting.
We'll see.
Well, next on Rising, Team Rising joins us to discuss Hunter Biden's latest venture, an art sale, when Rising returns.